$400 an acre. That is what one woman asked for a parcel of land that the county's leading bank had appraised at $62, and that every buyer who had heard the asking price had either laughed at or quietly declined and moved on. And she held that price for 10 years without moving a single dollar in either direction while the county decided, collectively, and without much internal debate, that she had dramatically and perhaps permanently misjudged what she was sitting on. By the end of those 10 years, the specific mineral composition of the soil on that parcel, the same composition the bank's own soil test had documented as a liability and used to justify its low appraisal, had made it the most sought-after growing ground in the region for a crop nobody in the county had planted commercially in living memory. And the land that the bank had valued at $62 an acre sold for $8,200 an acre to a specialty grain mill that had been searching for exactly that soil profile for 3 years. The man who had commissioned the bank's soil test, who chaired the county agricultural lending committee, and who had spent 10 years maintaining a polite but consistent position that Willa Foss was asking too much for ground that the evidence clearly showed was marginal, was the same man who sat in a county land use hearing watching a specialty crop agronomist read his own bank soil test data back to the room as the primary evidence that the land's documented composition had been misinterpreted rather than accurately valued. Marcus ELD had run Merchant County Bank's agricultural lending operation for 26 years, appraised or overseen the appraisal of nearly every significant parcel of farmland in the county during that time, and sat on the county's agricultural development committee that decided which farming directions the county extension program promoted and which it did not. He had sat across a desk from Willa Foss twice in 10 years, each time suggesting that $400 an acre was not a realistic expectation for the parcel in question, and each time she had told him she appreciated his opinion and continued to hold the price. He had never, in either of those conversations or in the years between them, asked what she knew about that soil that his own test had failed to explain in terms he'd found useful. None of that had happened yet on the gray autumn morning in 1983 when Willa Foss inherited 41 acres of hill country farmland from her grandfather and drove out to stand on it for the first time as its owner, looking at soil that crumbled pale and mineral-dense between her fingers and that her grandfather had always described, in the oblique way he described most things, as ground that was waiting for somebody to ask it the right question. To understand how 41 acres of land a bank appraised at $62 sold for $8,200 after a decade of being told the asking price was unreasonable, you have to start with the soil test, and with the specific things it measured that the bank's appraiser never thought to interpret as anything other than problems. Merchant County spread across its hill country in a way that rewarded conventional grain and cattle operations on the flatter lower ground and made the hillier parcels, the ones with thin, mineral-heavy soil and drainage patterns that worked against standard irrigation setups, into the land that cycled through owners and occasionally sat empty, assessed low and farmed marginally when farmed at all. Marcus ELD's bank had been the county's primary agricultural lender since his father had built it into that position in the 1950s, and Marcus had grown the operation further by becoming, over his first decade of running it, the person who effectively set the valuation baseline for agricultural land in the county through the bank's appraisal methodology, a methodology that weighted yield history and conventional crop compatibility heavily, and that had been developed with the county's dominant grain and cattle operations explicitly in mind. He sat on the Agricultural Development Committee that coordinated with the County Extension Program, the body that determined which cropping systems got researched, promoted, and recommended to county farmers, and the Extension Program's recommendations had aligned, for most of Marcus's tenure, with the conventional grain and forage crops that his bank's lending portfolio was built around supporting. People in Merchant County described Marcus ELD's judgment on land values the way people describe weather in a place where the weather is reliable, as simply the way things were, not as a position someone had taken that could be compared against alternative positions. Willa Foss had grown up in the county and left it at 18, spending 15 years working in agricultural research administration at a university 2 states away before her grandfather's death, and the inheritance brought her back to a piece of ground she hadn't walked since childhood. She had come back with habits of mind that the county didn't fully recognize as applicable to its situation, specifically a habit of looking for what a soil test actually said rather than what the person commissioning it needed it to say, and a familiarity with the specialty crop research literature that the county extension program had never engaged with in any depth, because the market for specialty crops in Merchant County had always been assumed to be too thin to support serious commercial production. Those assumptions were not wrong for most of the county's soil. They were specifically, documentably wrong for the 41 acres of mineral-dense hillside her grandfather had left her, and she knew it within 3 weeks of inheriting the land, because the first thing she had done after the funeral was drive to the county extension office and pull every soil test that had ever been filed for that parcel. The bank's appraisal arrived in her mailbox 6 weeks after the inheritance was formalized, a formal document with Marcus ELD's signature at the bottom, and a valuation of $62 an acre, supported by comparable sales data from similar hill country parcels, and a soil analysis that identified the parcel's high calcium carbonate content, elevated selenium levels, and unusual iron and zinc ratios as factors limiting its commercial viability for conventional grain and forage production. The appraisal language was careful and professionally accurate in the narrow sense that it was assessing the land against the county's conventional agricultural standard, and it was entirely silent on what those same documented characteristics meant in any other context. Willa read the soil analysis section twice and then pulled out the specialty grain research file she'd been building since she'd first looked at her grandfather's soil records, a collection of journal articles and conference papers and market reports she'd been accumulating for 3 weeks, and laid the bank's soil numbers alongside the growing requirement profiles for emmer wheat and einkorn and a handful of other ancient grain varieties that a small but expanding network of specialty flour mills and artisan bakers had been increasingly willing to pay significant premiums for, premiums driven specifically by the flavor and nutritional profiles those varieties developed in high mineral, naturally alkaline soils of exactly the composition the bank's test had just documented. She called the bank the following week and asked to meet with Marcus. He made time for her, because she was a new account holder with an inherited property and his job was to be available to account holders, and he sat across from her with the patient courtesy of a man who has had the conversation he expects to have many times before and knows approximately how it ends. She told him she was listing the property at $400 an acre. He told her, carefully and without condescension, that the bank's appraisal methodology was based on the strongest available comparable data and that $62 represented a fair assessment of what the market would bear for that type of parcel in the current environment. She thanked him for his time and listed it at $400. Pete Sar had farmed the land directly below Willa's parcel for 19 years, a modest mixed operation that he ran with his wife, and that produced reliable, if not spectacular results on ground that was better suited to conventional farming than Willa's hillside acreage, and he was the first neighbor to come and ask her directly what she was thinking with the price. He did it the way he did most things, standing at a fence post with a coffee cup and no particular urgency. And his question was more genuinely curious than skeptical, though the skepticism was present in the background. Marcus ELD told Harold Vines at the feed store, "You're asking $400 an acre for your grandfather's hill ground," Pete said. Harold told my wife. My wife told me. Nobody thinks the math works out. Willa asked him what he thought the ground could grow that would make $400 an acre work. Pete named the county's standard options, grain and hay, and maybe some specialty vegetables if the drainage could be improved, and said the soil wasn't really suited to any of them at a yield that would support that land price. Willa showed him the soil test numbers and asked him whether he knew what emmer wheat was. He said he'd heard the name, but couldn't have told her where it grew or what it needed. She explained what it needed, and Pete listened with the focused attention of a man who farms and therefore understands that soil requirements are not abstract. And when she was done, he was quiet for a moment before he said that he'd never thought of high selenium content as anything other than a problem for conventional crops, and that he supposed there were people who looked at the same number differently. He drove home that afternoon slightly more interested in the question than he'd expected to be, and mentioned to his wife that the Foss woman had a theory that sounded either very smart or very wrong, and that he was genuinely unsure which. Dr. Opal Crane ran the specialty grain agronomy program at the State Agricultural Research Station 2 counties over, a small but increasingly cited program that had spent 6 years documenting the soil and climate requirements for successful commercial production of ancient grain varieties in the region, and she came to Willa's parcel on a Tuesday morning in the spring of the 4th year at Willa's specific invitation, having received a letter that laid out the soil test numbers and asked whether they were consistent with the profiles Crane's program had documented as optimal for emmer and einkorn production. Crane walked the parcel for 2 hours before she said much, taking her own samples at 8 points and examining the natural drainage pattern with the methodical attention of someone who has learned that the photographs in a research file and the reality of a specific field are always somewhat different. When she came back to where Willa was waiting at the fence line, she said the thing Willa had been waiting 4 years to hear from someone with a credential. "This is the best naturally occurring profile I have personally walked in 6 years of looking for it," Crane said, with the clipped precision of someone choosing words carefully because they know what the words are going to imply for the person hearing them. "The selenium levels alone put this in the top 3% of parcels we've tested across the region. Combined with the calcium carbonate profile and the natural drainage, you're looking at the kind of soil that produces emmer and einkorn with nutritional and flavor characteristics that the mills we work with have been specifically requesting and specifically unable to source at the volumes they want. Because ground with this natural profile is not common and most of it has been conventionally farmed in ways that change the mineral balance." Willa asked her what the market looked like for a 41-acre commercial emmer operation in 5 years' time. Crane told her it depended on how many other producers got into the market and how quickly, but that the current trajectory of specialty grain demand from the artisan flour and baking sector suggested a window of at least several years in which supply would remain well below what the market was willing to absorb at premium pricing. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that a mill called Crestfield Grain in the city 2 hours south had specifically asked her program the previous year whether they knew of any Merchant County parcels with suitable soil profiles, because the company had been expanding its regional sourcing network and had identified the county's hill country geology as a potential match for what it needed. Willa asked for Crestfield Grain's contact information. Crane gave it to her before she left. Willa did not tell Marcus ELD or anyone connected to the bank or the Agricultural Development Committee about Opal Crane's visit or about her ongoing conversations with Crestfield Grain, and she made no changes to the way the property was listed or how she described it to the occasional buyer who called about it, continuing to quote $400 an acre and declining to negotiate downward regardless of how the caller characterized the local market. The conversations with Crestfield took 2 years to develop into anything that looked like a real pathway, because the mill was cautious about committing to a sourcing relationship before it had verified the soil profile independently and before it was confident the grower could manage the specific requirements of ancient grain production at commercial scale. Crane facilitated both of those verifications, the second by connecting Willa with a production consultant who had managed emmer operations in 2 other states, and who spent 3 days at the parcel in the 6th year working through the production plan with her. Pete Saar, who had been watching the occasional visits to the Foss parcel with growing curiosity and had started reading about ancient grains in the agricultural publications he received, asked Willa in the 7th year whether anything was developing with the property. She told him things were progressing. He asked whether he'd been right that it was either very smart or very wrong, and she told him she thought they were getting close to finding out. He drove home that evening and spent an hour reading about emmer wheat yields and market prices, and the following spring he asked Willa, somewhat tentatively, whether she might consider walking his own upper field and telling him honestly whether his soil had any of the profile hers did. She walked it with him and told him it had some of the characteristics, but not the selenium levels, which was important, and Pete nodded with the expression of a man who has just learned that the thing he hoped might apply to him is more specific than he'd understood. Marcus ELD heard about Crestfield Grain's interest in the Foss parcel in the 8th year, not from Willa, but from a regional agricultural lending newsletter that ran a short item about the mill's regional sourcing expansion program and mentioned, in passing, a Merchant County parcel under evaluation, a description specific enough that Marcus, who had appraised that parcel himself, recognized it immediately. He made 2 phone calls the following week and confirmed what he'd suspected, then pulled the bank's original soil test from the file and read the mineral composition numbers with a different question in mind than the one he'd been asking when the test was commissioned. The selenium levels he'd flagged as a liability for conventional grain production were the same numbers Opal Crane's program had documented as the defining characteristic of premium ancient grain growing ground. The calcium carbonate profile he'd cited as limiting irrigation compatibility was the same profile the specialty flour market was specifically seeking. He read the test twice more, then called the county extension office and asked whether anyone on staff had familiarity with the ancient grain research coming out of the state research station. The extension agent he spoke to said the program had come up a few times at regional conferences, but wasn't something the county had formally evaluated for local relevance. Marcus thanked him, filed the soil test back in the folder, and said nothing about the conversation to anyone at the bank or on the Agricultural Development Committee, because saying something would have required explaining why he hadn't asked that question 8 years earlier, and he was not ready for that conversation. What he did do, quietly, was revise the bank's internal soil appraisal guidelines to add a specialty crop compatibility assessment alongside the conventional crop yield analysis, a change he implemented as a routine methodology update without reference to any specific case that had prompted it. The county land use hearing that August was not convened to discuss the Foss parcel sale specifically, but to review a proposed zoning update affecting agricultural land classifications in the Hill Country section of the county, and it drew a larger attendance than such hearings usually managed because word had gotten around that Crestfield Grain's interest in the area might have implications beyond one parcel. Opal Crane was there at the invitation of the county planning department, which had asked her program for input on the ancient grain potential assessment that was being incorporated into the zoning review, and she presented the soil profile data from her 6 years of regional work alongside the specific findings from the Foss parcel, including the mineral composition numbers that the bank's original soil test had documented. She displayed those numbers on a projection screen beside the bank's own appraisal language from 10 years earlier, the language describing those same numbers as limiting factors, and let the comparison sit for a moment without comment before she explained what the specialty grain market understood the numbers to mean, which was the opposite of what the bank's language had implied. Marcus ELD was in the room, because he served on the Agricultural Development Committee that had been invited to the hearing, and he said nothing during Crane's presentation, which was the most notable thing about the meeting to anyone who had attended county agricultural hearings in the past decade. Because in 26 years of such meetings, Marcus ELD had never once sat through a technical presentation without interjecting at least twice. Willa Foss signed the sale agreement with Crestfield Grain 3 weeks after the hearing, at $8,200 an acre for a parcel the bank had appraised at $62 10 years earlier, a transaction that was reported in the regional agricultural press with enough factual specificity that anyone who wanted to do the arithmetic on the distance between those two numbers could do so without effort, and many people did. The ripple from the Foss sale moved through Merchant County's agricultural community in the way that unexpected reversals tend to move, slowly in some directions and fast in others. Pete Sarr enrolled his upper field in a trial run of Crane's ancient grain assessment program the following spring. And while his selenium levels were not high enough to match the Foss profile, the assessment identified a different set of characteristics on his lower ground that Crane's program connected to a separate specialty market, a development Pete described to his wife as the most useful thing that had happened to their operation in 15 years. The Agricultural Development Committee revised its extension program focus areas to include specialty crop evaluation for Hill Country parcels, a change that the county extension director described at the following year's conference as long overdue, and that several Hill Country landowners described more specifically as the difference between advice that had been useful for the county's conventional operations and advice that was useful for them. Marcus ELD retained his position at the bank and his seat on the committee because organizations of that kind do not typically remove people for having developed an appraisal methodology that was accurate within its original scope but incomplete outside it. And he continued to be, by any standard measure, the most experienced agricultural lender in Merchant County. What changed was that the bank's soil appraisal methodology now included the specialty crop compatibility assessment he had quietly added, and that the Agricultural Development Committee's agendas, for the first time in 26 years of his tenure, regularly included specialty crop items alongside the conventional grain and forage items that had always dominated them. He drove out to the Foss parcel himself in the fall after the sale closed, parking at the gate where he had twice sat across from Willa Foss, and explained to her that $400 an acre was not a realistic expectation. He asked her, with considerably less certainty in his voice than he had brought to either of those earlier conversations, whether she would be willing to walk him through the soil analysis framework she had used to arrive at her valuation, because he wanted to understand how she had read the same test data his office had commissioned and reached a conclusion so different from his own appraiser's conclusion. She told him she would, on as much time as he needed, and walked him through the specialty grain research literature alongside the bank's own test numbers for the better part of 2 hours at the field's edge, and he asked good questions in a way that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand rather than defend a position he already knew had been wrong. The lesson Merchant County eventually settled on from the whole affair was not comfortable to the people who had been most certain during the 10 years of Willa Foss holding a price that seemed unreasonable, because the lesson was essentially that the same data, read through different frameworks, produces different answers, and that the framework a county's dominant institution uses to read data is not automatically the only framework that produces correct answers or even the most useful one for the full range of questions the county's land actually poses. Marcus ELD had commissioned a soil test to value a piece of land, and the test had accurately documented what was in the soil. What the bank's appraisal methodology had never been designed to ask was what those documented characteristics meant to any buyer other than a conventional grain farmer. And for 10 years, that unasked question had kept the distance between $62 and $400 from collapsing, while Willa Foss held the price and waited for the market to ask it instead. The 41 acres that sold for $8,200 an acre had not changed. The soil composition in the bank's original test and the soil composition in Opal Crane's program assessment were the same soil composition. The only thing that had changed was which framework was being used to read the numbers. And the only reason that framework had changed was that a woman had held a price for 10 years that forced the question to eventually be asked by someone who knew the answer. Drive past the former Foss parcel today, and it looks, from the county road, like a field of unusual grain in an otherwise conventional-looking hill country landscape. The emmer heads a little lower and denser than modern wheat, the color slightly different at harvest, the rows not quite as uniform as the hybrid grain fields that dominate the lower valley. It looks like something slightly off from what you'd expect to see, which is more or less what it looked like for the 10 years nobody could figure out why it was being held at $400 an acre, and which is, as it turns out, more or less what the most valuable soil in the county has always looked like to anyone who wasn't asking the right question about it. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find it. Share it with someone who has ever been told that what they were sitting on was worth less than they knew it was. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there is a new one every week. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you held a price or a position that everyone around you said was wrong and turned out to be exactly right. We read every single one.